This is Lorraine Aguilar, and in this lecture we're going to look at ways to harness the science of influence to help us be more effective in our negotiations and our ability to persuade, engage, and activate other people. So let's take a closer look at what we'll be covering today. The first thing we're going to look at, of course, is our intentions, the ethics of using influence. And from there, we're going to go into a number of very specific research-based insights, as well as tips based on the fields of neuroscience, behavioral economics, and psychology. But first, let's look at ourselves for a moment. With any sort of power comes, of course, responsibility. And part of that is to be very clear about our intentions of using any of these data to help us be more influential. Of course, we want to influence for the greater good. And so that sometimes asks for a bit of self-awareness, some emotional intelligence. If we look at any sort of interaction, be it an attempt at leadership, trying to persuade someone, or trying to get the best results out of a negotiation, if we do it from a place of deception, or from a place of winner or loser, place of scarcity, a zero-sum game, or from a place of trying to leverage or exert power over another person to get them to do something that might be against their will. Any sort of forces like this tend to backfire in the long run, even though they might produce short-term gains. And a good reason for this is that people tend to be pretty smart. People tend to sense fairly quickly whether you have goodwill or authentic intentions in any situation. And for that reason, it's important to understand and use the power of a collaborative mindset, looking at ways, and this is the heart of innovation and creativity, instead of a zero-sum game where there's a winner or loser, to innovatively collaborate from a power-with relationship, a partnership relationship, where we can look at ways to meet the needs of everyone. That's why we keep coming back in this work to nonviolent communication. The spirit of finding creative solutions in any sort of leadership act, in any sort of negotiation or attempt to get someone on the same page with us. How do we do this in a way that serves the greater good? So at that, let's jump in. Our first insight is around a phenomenon known as anchoring, which is actually fairly well known among negotiators. It's the science-based fact that people tend to be influenced by the first piece of information or data given to them. An example of this was a study at the San Francisco Exploratorium, where visitors to the Exploratorium were divided into two groups and asked a similar question, but with different pieces of data. In one group, they were asked, what is the height of the tallest redwood? Is it more or less than 1,200 feet? What's your best guess? And that group, with that piece of data, the 1,200 feet, to influence their guess, came up with a mean of 844 feet. Now, a second group was asked the same question, but with a different piece of information that was fed to them. Is it more or less than 80 feet? What's your best guess? 282 feet. So did you notice how by changing the data, that also changed the guess? So let's look at some tips on how to use anchoring to help us be more influential. The first tip is to be aware that people might actually be anchoring with you. So how do you protect yourself from that? First of all, starting with the awareness that that could be possible. And secondly, by doing your homework. If you're, let's say, in a salary negotiation or trying to negotiate the price of something you're selling, know the value, know your value, know the value of the thing that you're offering. And that can be used as an objective standard from someone else's attempt to influence you. Now, what if you want to use anchoring to influence others? Well, it would stand to reason that you would want to start high and then concede in small steps. You want everyone to feel like we came out with a mutually agreeable result. But do be aware that the first thing you put out there is going to influence people's thinking. So in a salary negotiation, you wouldn't want to say, oh, this is the lowest thing I would accept as your first piece of data. You want to put your dream salary out there, a realistic one. So at that, let's move on to our next piece of science. Our next insight is something called loss aversion. And that's the neuroscience-based fact that our brains are hardwired to hate to lose. We would rather avoid loss than we would to gain something. A simple example is if someone was selling me something that could protect me from losing money, I would much rather buy that product or service than something you're offering me that could help me make money, if they're equal. So I'd rather buy a product or service that can prevent me from losing $100 a month than buying a product or service that can help me gain an extra $100 a month. Even though the net result is the same, our brains will naturally choose the loss avoidance. So that's why a lot of sales tactics involve showing discount or pain versus free gift with purchase. Those tend not to be as effective. So let's look at those tips. The first one is, if you're going to offer a solution, if you're going to try to engage people around an idea, a mission, a proposal, a solution, you want to focus on what negative thing you're going to prevent or what pain you're going to avoid. Also, since people tend to be risk averse to loss, that's why guarantees or trial periods are so important. For example, as a consultant, if I engage in a long-term contract with a client, I usually make sure that in the very beginning, after we initiate maybe the first or second training or workshop together, that they have an easy way out if for some reason it's not a fit. So, and then that gives them the safety to say, yes, let's look at a longer change program where we can really affect the culture, knowing that we can dip our toes in the water first before diving off the deep end. And then, of course, you want to be aware of scare tactics because, as with any scientific insight, it can be used to manipulate, and you want to be aware when people are using that against you. So if you notice people selling from a place of trying to scare you, the old help, I've fallen and I can't get up commercial comes to mind. Hopefully you should sniff that out, that you might be trying, it might be a manipulation tactic. Our next scientific insight is called social proof. And that's the phenomenon that people tend to follow the majority, follow the herd, which is why it's often called herd thinking, even when it goes against our better judgment. This is actually a very powerful and quite serious phenomenon in terms of implications. In 1951, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a set of very powerful experiments in which participants were brought in for what they thought was a vision test, in which they were shown a number of lines of different lengths and asked to comment on the lengths of the lines. Unknown to the participants were planted infiltrators, pretending to be participants, who claimed very firmly that these lines were in fact the same length. Now, when enough of these infiltrators entered the group, claiming that these lines were in fact the same length to them, the real participants started agreeing against factual evidence that these lines were different lengths that are obvious to the naked eye. They began claiming that the lines were equal length just because enough people said it loudly, firmly, strongly. How often do you see this in today's day and age? So this is the danger. It's not just the difference between facts and opinions, and everyone has a right to their opinion. This research of social proof shows that it actually crosses over into facts. That even when something is clearly not true, that people can still go with the majority. How many of the great tragedies, the great atrocities in our world's history have happened because we've gone with the majority instead of our own better judgment, instead of our own values? In smaller, maybe more daily interactions, how often do we exhibit brand loyalty, for example? We often see this in the PC versus Mac arenas without really comparing the attributes of the competitor. We might just blindly and automatically buy a certain product or brand. In the same way, we might vote for our party without really looking at the issues of the other candidates. In the office, we might see social proof at work when we believe gossip or when we buy in to people's reputations based on the majority opinion of a person versus our own experience of that person. This happens a lot in the workplace. I like to call it hero syndrome or villain syndrome, where depending on popular opinion, someone you work with might do no wrong while others can do no right. So how do we be mindful of social proof in our own desire to be influential people? First of all, be aware that some people may perceive your value or the value of your ideas, products, or services based on who else is buying into them or who else might be using them. That's why testimonials work. And even more so if the alpha animals of the herd are buying into your ideas or using your products or services. So there's power. There's power when other people claim how wonderful you are, your ideas, or whatever it is you might be selling. And on a more serious note, in terms of social consciousness, social proof invites us, I'd like to say really requires us, to be ever vigilant, ever self-aware of when we might be unknowingly or unconsciously influenced by the masses, even against our own better judgment. This is the time to be awake. Our next insight is reciprocity. And it's the old saying, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Research has shown that people naturally want to reciprocate an act of kindness or generosity. Now that might seem intuitive, but what's interesting about the research is the force or the amount of obligation people feel to return and reciprocate an act of kindness or generosity, even when that act had absolutely no strings attached and was a genuine gift of generosity. People still will attach their own strings of obligation regardless. We often see this phenomenon at play when it's time for donation season for many nonprofits. Around the holidays, it's not unusual to get all sorts of free gifts, whether it's a calendar or address labels, some sort of gift to encourage us to donate to that organization. So how do we be mindful of reciprocity in our own desire to be influential people? Well, first, it does help to establish yourself through genuine gifts of kindness or generosity to your professional network. That's why it's so useful to do things like contributing to user forums, mentoring, uh, referring, making connections, especially when it's done genuinely without expecting anything in return. People will naturally respond to that in wanting to be generous to you and kind. Another form of reciprocity is in gratitude. When we express gratitude to other people, people tend to be grateful for us. I still remember the time, and in fact have even kept the times that clients have sent me thank you cards. It's like, it just means so much when someone goes out of their way, even to write a little note. And that definitely touches that sense of reciprocity, of appreciation that we all so value. And then finally, if you have been generous and kind in supporting your own group or network of colleagues or friends, don't be shy about asking for help. Even if you didn't expect anything in return in the past, people will naturally want to help you out, especially if they see how generous and kind you've been to them or their community in the past. This is the beauty of human nature, is that when we're in a place of empathy or connection, we naturally want to give to each other and support each other's well-being. And so that's a really beautiful example of reciprocity alive in our communities and micro-communities. Next is what's called confirmation bias. And that's the scientific phenomenon that we tend to fish for data. People tend to give greater importance or seek out data that confirms pre-existing beliefs or opinions. We see this everywhere, unfortunately. You take a conspiracy theory of your choice, and I'm sure you will find in a quick search lots of data to support that, no matter how extravagant the theory. How do we use this phenomenon of confirmation bias in our own lives? First, be aware that it might be actually working against you. If you didn't make the desired first impression, for example, let's say if someone you meet might not consider you to be very trustworthy, they might be looking now at anything you say or do to confirm this opinion that maybe you might not be trustworthy. It goes back to that villain or hero effect that can be alive in the office place. People might see you as having a halo or horns, and then look at everything that you do or say through that filter. So for that reason, it's important to make a strong first impression, one that reflects how you want to be seen by people and genuinely seen. And flipping it around now, looking at other people's behaviors, how you see other people, it helps to use both the skill and the courage in asking powerful questions to help people who might be stuck in confirmation bias, might be stuck in their own perceptions. If you gently present facts or gently present questions that might reveal some of their assumptions and maybe help shift some of those assumptions without shaming them or, quote, making them wrong, there is an art to doing so. And that's how we influence each other, through gently opening each other's eyes to where we might have blind spots or where things like confirmation bias might be alive. Our next insight is the power of authority. And this is something that we're all probably very familiar with since early childhood. And yet, as adults, the power of authority is very much alive in our workplace and in our world. How often do we hold ourselves to a different standard, taking on work or being more responsive just because it's for the boss than if it were for a peer or subordinate? And in our world, it's hard to imagine how, I mean, from the Holocaust, even to military boot camps, how human beings can kill other human beings just because we're following orders. For better, for worse, this happens. And so, how can we be mindful of authority in our own lives in ways that can be helpful to us and to the greater good? So, first of all, looking at our own workplace, it helps that if you have an idea, a proposal, that you align it to that of an existing thought leader that will help leverage your own ideas. Or better yet, establish yourself as an authority in your own field, as your own thought leader, or in your organization, if not in your own field. And in terms of our own existence in this world, the power of authority really calls on all of us to be self-aware. Self-aware as to whether when we choose to do something, are we truly in choice, or are we doing something from a place of submission, out of compliance? Even when we feel like we've agreed to do something, for example, working late over the weekend because our boss asked us to do so, was it really a choice? Or was it from a place of compliance or submission? There's such a huge difference in terms of power when we go from, for example, the thought that I have to go to work to support my family. I have no choice. That's a place of submission or compliance. I have no choice. To saying that I choose to go to work because it's important to me that I support my family. There's a huge difference between I have to go to work and I choose to go to work. I have to stay in this marriage, or I choose to stay in this marriage, whatever it might be. This is the mindset of empowerment that can make all the difference in our lives and in the world. It's more than just language. It's where we put our power. Our next scientific insight is cognitive laziness. And that's the neurological phenomenon that our brains are hardwired to take shortcuts. Our brains would rather not have to process more information than it needs to. And for that reason, our brains tend to reach for the lowest hanging fruit and the most easily accessible information, which unfortunately has the danger of it could lead us to premature conclusions that might not be entirely accurate. There was a study done in which participants were given two different sentences. One was in boldface and the other in normal font. And they were asked to guess which one was most accurate. And of these two sentences, overwhelmingly, participants believed that the sentence in boldface was true, when in fact neither of the two sentences were true. So how can we be aware of this phenomenon that people tend to grab information that is most accessible or most obvious to us? If you're a website developer, you've probably already seen this at play in terms of how information is positioned on websites. So the real estate on the screen, you might say, that certain parts of the screen carry a lot more weight in terms of influencing people than other parts of the screen on a web page. So looking at our own lives, we want to be mindful whenever we present information, whether it's visually or verbally, that how we present information and in what order will influence other people's decision making. And for that reason, we want to make sure that the most obvious information or the first information we put out there is the most important. Again, we want to make the most readily available, the lowest hanging fruit, to be that sweetest, juiciest piece of fruit we want people to take, our most important idea or statement. Our last insight is likability. And it's the simple phenomenon that we are more influenced by people we like. We see this dynamic alive and well in the multi-level marketing industry, where people invite their friends or family over to a party where they sell something or they sell a line of something, such as Tupperware. In fact, a 1990 study was published in the Journal of Consumer Research on Tupperware parties and showed that purchase decisions were based twice as much on how much the guest liked their host, or in this case, hostess, than how much they liked the product itself. In other words, how much they liked the person selling the product was more important in a purchase decision than how much they liked the product. How can we be mindful of likability in our own lives? Well, it helps to know that research shows there's two ways that we can increase our likability. One is similarities, that if we can find ways to connect with others, often it could be that we're a similar age, have a similar life experience, similar hobbies, a favorite sports team. In my own case, I seem to find clients that love to play guitar, and we find ways to jam or incorporate music in our work. These types of little connections over similarities elevate the likability factor, and with that, the influence. The second way that we can increase our likability is through genuine acts of appreciation. And this has also been supported by research, that we tend to appreciate people who appreciate us and therefore are more influenced by these people. So at that, let me take this opportunity to express my appreciation to you for being with me throughout this entire lecture, and I hope that you use these insights ethically and well for your own good and for the greater good. So go out there and be influential.